Welcome back to the channel. Last time we stained this wall and it's somehow looking okay, and today we are going to put in the gravel backfill, so let's get right into it. Now you might be wondering why I am tearing up the yard in the front of my house when this is a backyard renovation. Well, the night before I filmed this, I had finally done it. I went online and I bought myself a rock. And no, Mom and Dad, I'm not getting engaged. It's one big rock crushed into a whole lot of smaller rocks that we are going to use for the gravel backfill and the drainage on the retaining wall. But because there isn't great access to the backyard, this is the closest place a dump truck can get to pour all of those rocks, which means we have to get it ready. I actually planned ahead with this and bought more than I needed for just the retaining wall, and what I'm going to do with that excess rock is use it as a gravel mulch in various places around the house. This spot on the side is going to be one of those places because this is normally where I park my trailer throughout the year, and I'm tired of having to constantly move the trailer every time I have to mow this area. So there's a couple areas like this that I think will be much lower maintenance and will just look a lot better with a gravel mulch. But before we put that gravel mulch down, we have to get rid of all of the weeds in the area, pull up as many of the roots as we can, level this out to the best of our ability with a rake, and then put down this landscape fabric as a weed blocker in the hopes that none of this stuff will come back in the future. I also thought this landscaping fabric would be enough so that if we had some at the edges towards the driveway, I could fold it up and try to consolidate it into a smaller area, but as you'll see in a second, that was probably not the best plan. Because this is the gravel getting delivered. So we had just the slightest bit of overflow there, but also this, and this, and this. This was 15 cubic yards in total of gravel, which means it is about 40,000 pounds of gravel. I am 6'2". This pile is almost up to my chest. It's about 4.5 to 5 feet tall. It's probably about 12 feet wide in some areas. It goes up several feet on that retaining wall that you see in the back. And while I thought I was so clever putting down that landscape fabric to contain this all, this is clearly a much larger pile than I had expected. By comparison, my SUV is about 4,500 pounds. This pile of rocks is about 9 times as heavy. It goes up to the window line on my SUV, and as you can see, it is several feet wider. And we get to move this massive pile of rocks using the cutting edge technology of this shovel. There is not a better or easier way to do this. I have to shovel it into the wheelbarrow and maneuver it over to its final destination. Now, of course, the final destination in this case is behind the retaining wall to make that drainage system. Obviously, before I pour it back there, I want to get as much of this other dirt and stuff out of the way because quite frankly, the water is not really going to flow through that properly, which could create more issues. And as I've said, I have zero desire to ever have to do this project again. Per code, you do have to have a certain width of gravel behind the wall. If you have more gravel than that, so for example, if you went out 2 feet instead of 1 foot, it means that you will use twice as much gravel as you need, which means you have twice the amount of materials, so twice the cost, but also twice the labor of shoveling it and moving it back. So for me, the code is 1 foot of gravel. I want to get as close to that 1 foot as I possibly can, unless I absolutely need more because I have an area with bad drainage. So on the back side, I clear out that first 12 inches all the way to the bottom. I put down this landscape fabric, which is going to act as a barrier and keep all this dirt from clogging up the drainage over time. And then we can start putting the gravel over the top of it. Now, at first, I just did a couple shovelfuls to kind of weigh down the bottom and make sure everything was properly in place. I didn't really need a ton. It was just a nice little layer at the bottom to basically act as a paperweight. And as I'll explain more in a minute, I used some old plywood that I wasn't comfortable using on any other project to build myself the gravel blocker 3000 and 5000, and I used some of those leftover scrap boards from the concrete mold, cut those into 1 foot sections, and those became my calibrated measuring sticks to make sure that the concrete blocker 3 and 5000s were always the right distance from the wall. So let's go into these in a little more detail. So here is the game plan, as I basically made these as blocker panels, and I put these blocks in the back so that we have a handle to pull them up out of the ground after we have stone in the front and dirt in the back. So basically we're using this as an artificial barrier so that we don't overflow one in one direction or the other. That way we have enough drainage, but we're not overfilling with rock, so we have enough rock for the whole project. Then this one is obviously bigger to go through all of these spans because they're all roughly the same size. But it's all the same principle, except this one I put a block on both sides so that way you get a better gripping surface. Now obviously you also want this evenly spaced from a depth perspective.
alternative. That way, first of all, it's just consistent, and then second of all, again, you're not using too much rock because that drives up the price. So what I did is I cut this to 1 foot, which is the amount of drainage stone that we need. And then you have a nice marker, no matter where you put it, to make sure that that upright is exactly 1 foot from this wall. But we very quickly figured out that 1 is not enough, so I just cut 3 more as well. These are all the same length. But the 2 things that are the biggest struggle so far is 1, I already stained this wall, so all this lifting up and over, every time we do that, something like this happens where we're chipping the back corner, and then we can see a non-stained section below. I might have to do a little bit of touch up at the end because of this. And the second big issue is lifting the gravel up and over to go into this channel behind the wall. Now, this stuff is heavy. It does not shovel well. The shovel doesn't just go into it like dirt. You have to kind of like go through all the jagged edges. So instead, I'm going to try something a little bit different that you're going to see in a second that I think is still going to damage this front edge specifically, but that will help this go a lot faster. So I'm going to give that a try, and if that works, you'll see me do that for the whole project.
Before executing my brilliant plan, I was setting up the Gravel Blocker 5000, which is just the bigger model, and this one's large enough that you actually do have to backfill some of the dirt to compact it at the bottom, otherwise the weight of it alone is going to tip it over. It's also very prone to catching wind, as I found out later in the project. If you're doing this on your own, just be careful and make sure that it's actually supported properly. But once I had that set up and a bunch of these weeds out of the way, I grabbed this ramp with the brilliant thought of trying to get the wheelbarrow up the ramp and then pouring it using this piece of plywood as a backsplash to get all of the gravel directly into the hole. The problem is this gravel is a lot heavier than it probably looks on camera, and trying to stop this in the perfect location while you're pushing it up an inclined surface after working in the sun all day is not nearly as easy as it might sound. As a result, I definitely overshot it, but even scooping it over the side into the hole from here was a heck of a lot easier than doing it over the top of the wall and onto the backside. So still an improvement from what we were doing, but definitely not a perfect method. The other issue is that the length of the ramp was very close to the length between my house and the retaining wall, meaning that using the ramp wasn't going to be feasible for the majority of this retaining wall. Furthermore, the metal frame on the bottom of the wheelbarrow also dug into the retaining wall and chipped away a bit of that front edge in some places, exposing the unstained surface. At this point, I pretty much accepted that I would have to go back at the end and do a little bit of touch-up because that was going to be a problem throughout. But there was one other little trick to adding the gravel using these plywood pieces. As you add gravel to the one side, that's adding weight and pressure onto the plywood, so you have to equally add pressure to the backside, otherwise this will tip one way or the other. And obviously you just do that by shoveling more dirt onto that backside, but you also have to kind of jump on it a little bit to compact it down, otherwise the density really isn't there and the weight of the gravel will compact it for you at the expense of leaning this whole thing back and not really having the correct measurement at the end. But as you can see on the far right near where the old retaining wall is, once you've filled both the front with the gravel and the back with the dirt, you can just slide these plywood pieces out of place and everything else will stay where it is. Now one thing you might notice is I did not do a perforated pipe at the bottom of this gravel, which is required in a lot of areas. Since the footing here is entirely concrete with a rock ledge directly below it, it really doesn't matter where I move that water, I have to get it to drain somewhere that isn't rock ledge, so there wasn't really a good place to dump it that wouldn't create other issues. Furthermore, I'm actually using a little bit more gravel than I need to for the height of this wall, so for that reason my drainage is actually sufficient as it is. Another quick lesson is how much force it's going to take to pull out those pieces of plywood depends on how much force there is holding these in place. So if your retaining wall is taller and you have a higher pile of dirt or gravel pushing against it, that is effectively going to add more force. It's going to be harder to pull out. Similarly, if you have a wider piece of plywood like this bigger one we have here, that has more surface area than the smaller piece. It has more gravel and dirt along the entire length. That is also going to be harder to pull out at the end. I'm saying this because depending on how big of a wall or how much manpower you have, you might be able to do a larger or shorter section at a time. You're going to have to judge that based on what you have available and how strong you are. And I, of course, figured that out the hard way. Now, I had already filled the gravel a couple inches below that front lip, and I'll discuss that in a while, but even so, I had to either remove or redistribute a lot of the gravel to put less force on this thing because, quite frankly, it was clamped in there really tight, and I didn't think I could get it out without breaking this board. Or, on the other hand, beforehand without injuring myself, which I think was the much bigger concern because quite frankly I am old and fragile at this point. But what I lack in brute strength I make up for in ingenuity. So I ran into my garage, grabbed my car jack, and then started prying up against those two handles that I made because I saw no other way of applying enough force to get this thing out, and I sure as hell was not digging this rock back out after I put it in. After I got the initial movement, I was able to pull it back and forth and get it out by hand, but let me just say, lesson learned, don't overfill it if you don't have the manpower to pull it. At this point you might be asking yourself, well, if you had trouble pulling it out, why did you immediately put it in the next section and do it again? And the answer is quite simple. When it was stuck, it's because I went full height on both the front and the back, but you can avoid that issue by starting to remove it once you have a certain amount of height added. So for example, if you add about 1.5 feet and then slide the thing up by about 6 to 8 inches, then you can add about another 1 or 2 feet, slide it up a little bit more, and just incrementally add the fill material on the front and back as you slide this thing out. It'll never really get stuck at that point. The problem really only comes when you are way overstacked on the front and the back, especially when you have a massive amount of surface area like this one does. This was a lot of rinse and repeat and just doing the same laborious tasks the whole way down the wall, and the only other surprise was when one of my neighbors, Jerry, just kind of swung by and honestly shocked the hell out of me when he just wandered into my backyard. Super nice guy, great neighbor, but when I turned around and there was someone just standing there, not gonna lie, it scared the hell out of me. But anyhow, this was really good progress for a single day. For 2 people working about 6 hours on this is how much we got done. This doesn't look like a lot on camera, it doesn't come off as visually impressive, but this was thousands of pounds of rocks that we shoveled. A quick tip, I ended up folding this landscaping fabric over the top of the rocks while I let it sit when I wasn't working on it. That way there was a lower chance of any dirt or sand blowing in and clogging up that drainage system. And then jumping back to the rock pile in the front of the house, here's what it was at the start of the day, and here's what it was at the end of the day. That was so much rocks that you can actually see the bottom corner of my house again and walk around that corner without having to scale a small gravel mountain. Now let's jump to the next afternoon where I had run out of excuses to procrastinate and had more progress to make.
Alright, it is the afternoon after today. I was way more sore than I thought I would be because this is way heavier than I thought it would be. So I tried to delay as much as I possibly could and did everything else to try to not have to do this today because I'm so sore. For example, I cut my hair, I cut the yard, I shaved my body like a swimmer. But I have run out of excuses, so now we have to continue with this. So my goal is to get one more section done today. We got to lay down a little bit more landscape fabric as well. We're kind of running a little bit low on that, and then hopefully I'm calling it quits at least for today. I've only got about a 3-hour window, but let's get done what we can. And as much as I don't want to do it, it needs to get done. It's not going to do itself.
Day 2 of absolutely rocking this project, see what I did there, was a little bit tougher because I had to load both the front and the back on my own. Now overnight I did think about how it was a pain to hold up that landscaping fabric when I started filling this in. Today what I decided to try was stapling it to that plywood backer when I started to hold it up. That actually seemed to be working pretty well, and the other difficulty I knew I was going to have was trying to go around these corners. Trying to keep that nice 12-inch distance while I had these 2 separate angle changes was going to be tough, but if you just take your time, do the gradual filling, you know, like a foot or 2 at a time and go back and forth between the 2 sections, it's not like it's impossible or even necessarily difficult, it's just time consuming. And at this point, that's really what this project is time consuming and hard labor. Doing all the angles and cuts and measurements when actually building the wall was a little bit more mentally straining. This is just purely physical. And as part of that physical strain, this backer board definitely fell down and perfectly scraped my entire shin at one point, which let me just say was less than pleasant, but unfortunately that's part of the game when you're doing physical labor, is getting bumps and scrapes and bruises. That said, this is a great side shot where you can see me loading both the front and the back of this and how the plywood leans one way or the other based on which side I'm loading up more, but this gives you a really good idea of not only what I'm doing but how I handled the angle change using those 2 separate pieces of plywood. Another thing I want to know is what I mentioned earlier, I'm not going up to the very top edge here, I'm leaving it a few inches low deliberately. The reason for that is I'm going to add an edging towards the end. I want some of this rock exposed because I like how that looks, but I have to add the last few inches of sand and or gravel after that's in, otherwise I have nothing to hold it in place. So once again, I'm not going to add in anything now if I know I'm going to have to dig it out later. But at this point, I was nearing the end of day 2, and with my scraped shin, I was ready to call it quits. While it doesn't look like we covered a huge distance, these angled bits are noticeably harder harder than the straight sections. But even though it doesn't really feel like or look like we got a whole lot done, when you jump back to this rock pile in the front, it is finally at the point where it's visually going down, which is almost unbelievable considering, once again, this was 40,000 pounds. Honestly, the amount of rock that we started with was more than a little bit intimidating and overwhelming, so even getting to this point where we finally see a noticeable dent in this pile felt like huge progress to me. But that's good for day 2, let's jump to day 3.
It is the next day and we got a few things going against us. First is the temperature. It was 91 degrees today. It's still very hot. It feels about high 80s, low 90s still. Second is I have had 2 physical therapy appointments today, both working on my shoulders, so those are quite sore. But it's going to be raining probably in about 2 days from now pretty heavily, and with my luck, if we don't finish this, all of the sand's gonna wash into the part that I've already started, and we're gonna have to redo some stuff. So with all that, let's get back to it.
That's right, the continued threat of rainfall was once again making it a necessity to squeeze in every single hour I could after work. And the first thing I figured out was the backer board we had was too long for this last section, especially with the dead man in the middle, so I cut it into 2 smaller pieces knowing that this was the last section we had to get done. Now fortunately, this section had a much smaller angle change than that other front corner, so that was easier to deal with, and the big pile of dirt was literally right there, making it the easiest section to shovel to. If at any point you were wondering why I had this big mountain of dirt in the middle, this is literally why I had them leave it during the excavation, was to backfill these sections once the retaining wall was built. And overall this section went pretty quick at a couple of hours, but I realized I never really built an end cap by that back staircase, so I was a little hesitant to overfill that section, worried of course that it would spill out over the side, meaning that I did cut this a little bit short. So let's jump into my thoughts after cleaning up for the day.
All right, didn't think we'd make it, but here we are. Last section is backfilled, and now we get to grade all of that, which may be the hard part.
But jumping back to the front, this is what our rock pile was looking like today, and we had made progress once again.
Jumping forward in the week here, as you can see, all of the ground is now wet because we finally got the rain I was talking about, but it cleaned off all of these stones fairly well, and as you can see, they are pretty much a completely different color than what they looked like before when they were really covered in all that stone dust still. But a lot of the stone now has this more bright, natural appearance to it, and it looks a lot better, I think. So this is almost a perfect color combo for what I'm going to be going for. I am very happy with that.
Jumping to the front yard, you'll see that this rock pile got cleaned off as well. Much brighter, richer tone now, which is going to match much better, especially with the house color.
Either way though, the first section of this wall is complete. I am going to take a few days off because I think at this point I've probably earned it.
But that'll do it for this episode, and we'll resume next time where I get to level out this yard and then potentially clean up some of these other rocks that I dropped. Thank you for watching.